So you should have a little button to say that that's happening now. Secondly, if at any point you want to ask a question, there's something that you're unsure of and you want clarification, or you just have a slightly different perspective that you'd like to discuss, we are all happy to not be interrupted, that's the wrong phrase, but for questions to be answered as we're talking, as those questions have a relevant place in the conversation. We may also deem them that it'll be better to pick them up at the end of the conversation, but of course we will leave time for that as we always do. So last thing is just to say thank you very much, everybody, for your registration and your interest in this evening's talk. It's lovely to see so many recurring faces. It's wonderful to be able to share different aspects of our work with you. And this one is going to take a slightly different format for our normal scientific lectures. We're going to be more in a conversation around a particular aspect of our work and how it may differ slightly, how it's exactly the same considerations and just how that works. But this is something that we've often discussed in the office. We've developed a wonderful relationship with KeshetUK and Ariel as well. And that's something that we wanted to share and we wanted to bring to a wider audience, just to kind of talk through a little bit about our decision processes behind that, how our understanding has developed, and how it just becomes a normal part of our work. So just to introduce myself, for those of you that I haven't met, I'm sorry, and also to say hello to new faces as well, people from the KeshetUK mailing list and database as well. I hope you enjoy, and I hope you kind of develop an engagement with Jnetics as well. So just to introduce myself, I'm Josh. I'm the head of science, education and outreach at Jnetics. And so my job very much is going out and talking about the genetics and Jewish genetic disorders and how we can screen, what we can do, why it's important, that kind of thing. But also I spend a lot of time researching and learning about the actual science behind what we're doing, making sure that we're up to date with the cutting edge work as well. And really that we are at the cutting edge and are making these considerations to keep the next generation of Jewish children safe from devastating genetic disorders that we screen for. We are currently screening for 49 life-shortening, debilitating recessive diseases, such as Tay-Sachs, cystic fibrosis, spinal muscular atrophy, which has actually been in the news recently. And the aim simply is to educate and to keep children of the next generation safe from these conditions. Just to introduce myself as well, just so you all know a little bit about where I'm coming from. I have come into this role just under 2 years ago now, and I came from the world of education. I was a biology teacher and a head of science in a range of schools. I worked both within the Jewish education system and the non-Jewish system. And really what I love about this role and what really drew me to the work of Jnetics, apart from its life-saving work, of course, is the fact that I get to talk about science all day, every day, with people that have chosen to listen now. So that's very much me, where I'm coming from. And I think I'll pass over to Ariel next.
Thank you very much. So I'm Ariel. I'm the Executive Director of KeshetUK. I'll explain who KeshetUK are in just a moment, but kind of on Josh's lead there, a little bit about me. I worked in diversity and inclusion for over a decade, including roles in higher education, and my specialisms were always in LGBT plus inclusion and Jewish inclusion. So when this role at KeshetUK came up I've been in post about 18 months now. It was the perfect role really for me. It brought those two passions together. And about KeshetUK, for anyone who doesn't know, we are the UK's only Jewish LGBT plus education and training charity, and we work with just over 6,000 people across the UK every year in Jewish schools, synagogues, communal organisations, and we deliver education and training with the aim to help build a UK Jewish community where no one is forced to choose between their Jewish and LGBT plus identities. And it's such a pleasure to be here tonight. So thank you for involving us.
Cool. And Joe?
Hi everyone, my name's Jo. So I currently work for an organisation called Genomics England, and I'm working on a very large-scale government-funded research project to expand newborn genomic screening in newborn babies. I've been there for about 4 years, and I lead on the evaluation of the study. So hopefully, working with NHS England to see if what we're doing could be commissioned potentially as a clinical service in future. And before I joined Genomics England, I've been working in government for 10 years on healthcare policy, particularly in Department of Health and Social Care and at number 10 Downing Street. And before that, I was in academia doing a PhD in genomics. So my interest here is kind of twofold, really. Firstly, I'm on the Scientific and Medical Advisory Committee at Jnetics, and I'm also a trustee of KeshetUK. So my real kind of passion is for healthcare equality. So this particular event really kind of brings that together for me, my interest both in genomics and in the equity side of things.
Brilliant, thank you. Shall we kick off with the questions that we've structured? So Ariel, do you want to take us away?
Yeah, and I know that for some people in the audience, they will know this, but there's also a fair few who don't. And the first one is, what actually is genetic testing?
Of course. So genetic testing really, or the genetic testing that we do at Jnetics, is all about identifying if people are carrying a recessive condition. Now, a recessive condition is something that chances are you don't know that you have within your DNA. Now, each of us have 2 copies of every gene in our body. We're going to choose to ignore the X and Y chromosomes for a moment. Everybody has 2 versions of every gene in their body. One is from their mother and one is from their father. Now, because we have 2 copies of every gene, we have a little bit of redundancy in that system, i.e. if one isn't quite working properly, we have the other one to compensate, so it's hidden. Now, a much more kind of day-to-day way that we might see this, for example, is eye color. People often say blue eyes can skip a generation or red hair can skip a generation, and that's because they're what we call recessive features. You have to have 2 versions of the recessive gene, or the one that can hide if you have the other version. So for example, dark hair is what we call the dominant version, whereas blonde hair is the recessive. Now, Joe, I apologize for this phrasing, but in effect, the blonde hair version is the absence of the darker dye. I feel like you're going to tell me off and say that I'm wrong with this, but that's the general way that I understand it. So what happens is, if I'm a carrier of blonde hair, number one, my children would be so lucky. But secondly, that means that I have a blonde hair gene and a brown hair gene. But because the brown is producing the dye, that kind of covers that blonde trait. Now, the same thing can happen in terms of disease. And for example, the most well-known ones that we look at are things like Tay-Sachs and cystic fibrosis. Now, if you're a carrier of one of those, what that means is you have one gene that would cause Tay-Sachs or cystic fibrosis, but you have the healthy gene as well. So that does that job. So you don't suffer and you have no effects of it. However, if both parents happen to be carriers of this disease gene in their second version of their DNA, then each child they have has a 1 in 4 chance of developing that disorder. And really, that's what we want to prevent. So the genetic screening works by people registering with us, or we reach out to them in schools and universities, places like that. And you take a DNA sample, which is simply just a cheek swab. You get a little cotton pad, you rub it on the inside of your cheeks, You pop it back into the bottle and you give it to us or you post it back to us. We then send it off to our lab. They sequence the whole genome. It's technically called a clinical genome for the scientists in here, clinical exome, I should say. So around 7,000 genes. We have selected those that are most prevalent in the Jewish community and are severe of a kind of a sufficient severity to warrant this kind of work. And then our genetic counselor will share those results with you. It turns out that of the 49 we screen, over 1 in 3 people of Jewish descent carry at least one gene that we screen for. So it's actually 42%. So it's almost half of us carry something on our panel. Now, the most common are the ones that we know most about. Tay-Sachs, cystic fibrosis, spinal muscular atrophy, Canavan's disease, for example. These are all ones that you might not have come across, but actually are relatively common to be carriers. For example, cystic fibrosis is the most common condition on our panel, and 1 in 25 people of Jewish descent carry that. And when I go to talk in universities or schools, I often say that's one child in every class. Like, that's a lot of people. And it doesn't take much to imagine that person in class 1 and person in class 2 are the people that end up together. So that's really what the genetic testing is. Now, the whole point of that is that if you know that both you and your partner carry the same genetic disorder, we are now lucky enough to be able to overcome that and to reduce that risk, or to kind of completely remove that risk. There's various interventions that you can go down. I will be honest, none of them are completely painless and completely easy, but many people would say that they are significantly less painful than watching a child go through the pain and the suffering that these conditions can bring. The first one is a form of IVF called PGT, whereby you undergo IVF in the same as the normal manner, but any embryo that's developed is checked for the presence of that disease and then only implanted if they're not going to have the disease. It's generally much more successful than kind of a regular version of IVF because there are no fertility issues for the people doing the IVF. So that tends to have a very good success rate. And the second is that people can conceive naturally and then do early genetic screening on the embryo in utero. But then you also have potential downstream decisions to make, such as a termination or knowing that you're going to bring a child into the world with one of those conditions. So there are routes to it to protect that next generation. And really, that's what we're looking to do. We also have another type of genetic testing that we do lots of. I say we do lots of, we talk about a lot, but actually we're lucky enough that the NHS do that testing. And that's for something called the BRCA gene. Now, the BRCA gene works differently to the recessive panel, but this is a gene that, once again, is really common in those of Jewish descent, both Ashkenazi and Sephardi. And if you carry a gene variation in your BRCA gene, it means that you have a much higher lifetime risk of developing certain types of cancers. Now, this happens because the BRCA gene is a fundamental gene. It's a really, really important gene for everybody. We all carry BRCA genes, and what that gene does is it proofreads our DNA. It's a bit like an accountant. It goes through every line of your DNA when your cells are replicating, and it looks for any small errors. And if there are any errors, it picks them up and it changes them. Or if there's too many of those errors, it just destroys that cell so that it's not going to cause any problems. However, when one of your versions isn't working, it means that you're much more susceptible to cancer developing, because cancer is effectively when our DNA goes a bit wrong and our cells no longer function properly. So that's a very, very baseline version of it. But so what that means is that if you have a gene variation in your BRCA gene, now we are lucky enough that we can identify that and then take some action. So this is the NHS Jewish BRCA program. So this one is for anybody that is over 18, living in England and has at least one Jewish grandparent. And if you are female, for example, and you're identified as a BRCA carrier, then you are entered onto high risk screenings for because breast cancer and ovarian cancer are two of the cancers that are exacerbated, or the risk is increased. So you can have mammograms, for example, and so that any cancer can be caught early, or you can also undergo prophylactic or preventative surgeries, so to remove breast tissue or ovaries, for example. If you are born male at birth, there isn't that screening in place currently, although it has just been recommended that prostate screening for anyone with a BRCA gene is now to be recommended as standard. And there is the PSA test, and that was a big story in the news around Christmas time, that PSA testing shouldn't be recommended, but actually for those with a BRCA mutation, it is recommended. And that is also, you can request the PSA test from a GP at any point as well. And you should always be offered that if you do request. So the other cancer, so I realized I didn't mention the cancers. It's breast cancer, ovarian cancer, prostate cancer, and pancreatic cancer that are exacerbated. So really that is the genetic testing that we do, and the work that we share. Jo, you look like you want to come in with something.
Great, yes. So I was just looking at the questions. We've had a question come in from Judith that I can take quite quickly. It says, please, can you explain the difference between genetics and genomics? So genetics refers to genes. So genes are the part of our DNA that is coding. That means it codes for a protein. And between our genes, we have a lot of other DNA that doesn't code for a protein, that is not genes. Now, historically, people used to think that this DNA that was in between genes was junk DNA. They thought it didn't do anything. Now we've learned a lot more about genomics, and we know that that bit in between actually does do a lot, and it regulates genes. It turns them on, it turns them up, it turns them down. So the difference between genetics and genomics, to be honest, it's really kind of a historical and a modern term, really. Genetics historically referred to just really the coding region of the gene. Now, when we talk about genomics, we talk about the entirety of the DNA, because we know it's not just the genes that play a crucial role in our genes and our gene regulation.
So just to pick on that, or jump onto that. So when we talk about those bits in between our genes, so that what we historically called junk DNA that we now is simply non-coding DNA, is that to do with the regulation of when genes are active, or is there actually more to it?
There's a whole host of things in the non-coding regions, which we historically would call introns. There is a introns and kind of intergenomic regions as well, intergene regions as well. So there is, someone's saying that they've lost sound. I'm not sure if that's everyone. Hopefully that's not everyone, but please shout if it is. So yeah, it's to do with gene regulation. So how we turn genes up and turn genes down. And then there's also kind of a lot of other different things in there, where our environmental factors basically interact with the genomic DNA to upregulate or downregulate genes.
Brilliant, thank you. That development has really come along since I graduated, so that's not something that I learned about whilst I was at university, actually. So I do find it fascinating. Bits of transcription
also had another question, Josh. I know that
Yep.
Ariel is eager to come in with some questions as well, but just very quickly, perhaps, Josh, you could answer this one. Diana has said that her husband has been offered NHS BRCA testing, but without any family history. Can you address that?
So number one, that could be through the Jewish BRCA program, that people are eligible just with DNA, just with Jewish ancestry. Secondly, it's likely to be with your personal cancer risk. Family history isn't the only reason for a doctor to suspect that it is worth checking for a BRCA mutation. Without knowing his particular history, or his particular what's going on with your husband, Diana. But there is more to it than simply you have a first degree relative with a BRCA mutation if you're outside of the Jewish BRCA program. Also, it could simply be that your consultant is particularly up on their genetics and they actually understand that there is a value in understanding the genetics and genetic mutations of cancers. So if he's had an early onset cancer, for example, that could be part of it, because many of the hereditary cancers will behave in quite specific ways. Therefore, the therapeutic pathway that a doctor chooses to take will differ depending on, for example, if they have a BRCA mutation or not. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thanks. I mean, I think it was just because he was offered it when they were doing the prostate testing. It was just
Right.
the panel. I don't know, maybe the GP had some interest or had some funding. I don't know, but we were quite surprised as he was offered.
So did your GP know that he's of Ashkenazi Jewish descent?
Yeah.
So it could have been that, because the profile has been increasing recently, for example, with the Jewish BRCA program. So it could have been that he's heard that people of Ashkenazi Jewish descent have a higher prevalence, which actually means that it's working. The messaging is getting through. So thank you for sharing that. I'm quite happy to hear that.
Okay, good.
Ooh, thank you.
Thank you both. I'm going to stick with Joe for a question. So let's say that someone is Jewish, they're in a same-sex relationship, and they're planning to start their family. Is carrier screening still relevant to them?
Yeah, so absolutely it is. So genetics carrier screening is relevant for anyone with one or more Jewish grandparents who intends to start their own biological family. And that is true regardless of the route that they take to start that family. For example, it could be via surrogacy, it could be via sperm donation. So the same will be true regardless of your sexual orientation or your gender identity. But there are some specific circumstances around genetic testing whereby a donor egg or a sperm is used, and we already know that the other biological parent is a carrier of a rare disease. And in those circumstances, we would recommend that you would have the discussion with your clinic because it can be quite challenging. I mean, there's been some kind of, you may have seen some things in the news recently around known carriers who have donated sperm and then those children have gone on to develop conditions. So if you know that the member of the parent who is providing the sperm or egg and you're using a donor for the other biological parent, then I would recommend that you would have that discussion with your clinic just to deal with your kind of specific needs there. But in general, if you yourself are Jewish, then absolutely it would be relevant to you. The only time when it wouldn't be relevant is if you were planning to start your family via adoption.
Thank you.
Can I just kind of go on to that? One story that we shared last year, actually, of one of an example of this exact thing. It was a case from America where a gay couple called Rick and Bruce wanted to have a child via surrogacy, and part of that process was that they mixed their sperm when undergoing IVF. Therefore, both of them, kind of a bit of a Schrodinger's father, I guess. They could kind of both consider themselves the biological father because there's no kind of decision-making process within that. Neither of them were Jewish, I have to say. So Tay-Sachs wasn't kind of on the cards. And so actually their doctor said, I specifically didn't test you for Tay-Sachs because neither of you are Jewish. But of course, there is Tay-Sachs within the general population as well. It's just much, much rarer. And it turned out that one of the daughter that was born through this surrogacy and IVF did develop Tay-Sachs. Her name was Christy. And it turns out that the woman that donated the egg was also a carrier of Tay-Sachs, and one of the fathers were. So it did de facto give it away who was the father, I suppose. But so it does happen, or it can happen, I should say, and therefore this kind of testing does have a genuine impact on your reproductive choices. Because, for example, in that scenario, you would have chosen the father to be that doesn't carry that genetic disorder, or certainly one that doesn't match with the donor, for example. And you would know what to look for in clinical testing prior to fertilization and IVF. So it is something that is kind of, there are real life contexts as to why it is important.
Thank you. And I want to take us back to BRCA screening as well. Again, I'm probably going to come to you, Joe, on this one. If someone is a Jewish trans man, is BRCA screening still relevant for them?
Yes, so BRCA screening is relevant for any person with one or more Jewish grandparents. And as Josh has mentioned, that will be available on the NHS later this year. I noticed that Anthony Angel has also asked a comment around this. So anyone with Jewish ancestry is available with Jewish BRCA. And this is equally relevant for men, women, trans, and non-binary people. So having a genetic change within a BRCA gene, as Josh described before, can raise the risk of breast cancer in people of any gender. And it also increases the risk of some other cancers as well. As we mentioned before, ovarian cancer, prostate cancer, and pancreatic cancer all have a raised risk. So knowing your BRCA status can help provide you with the knowledge that can enable you to have a discussion with your doctor about the right approach to screening for you. And so BRCA screening is therefore relevant for anyone with Jewish ancestry, regardless of their gender identity.
And what about, in that same scenario, what about if they've already had top surgery?
Yeah, so that's a really, really good question. So following the identification of a genetic change in a BRCA gene that can increase the risk of breast and other cancers, some people with breasts would opt for a risk-reducing surgery, which is known as a prophylactic or preventative mastectomy. And while this particular surgery does have similarities with top surgery, which is also known as a gender-affirming mastectomy, the two procedures are not completely the same. So therefore, BRCA screening is still going to be relevant for a trans man who is post-surgery, in order that any kind of appropriate and preventative measures can be taken if their BRCA screen does come back positive. But on top of that, as we mentioned before, BRCA variants also increase the risk of other cancers, and therefore BRCA screening post-surgery would still be relevant for anyone with Jewish ancestry, regardless of their gender identity.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you.
I think this is for either of you to answer. Are there any stories where this has happened that you know?
It definitely has happened, but I don't know any specific cases. That's a very good question. I will have to go and do some research, because I know. So for context, as Joe very eloquently put, there is a difference between a risk-reducing mastectomy and gender-affirming mastectomy. And generally, even in risk-reducing surgery, whereas much of the breast tissue as possible is removed, there is still a residual risk of breast cancer developing. So that is simply because in a mastectomy, it's very, very difficult to reduce all of the breast tissue completely. And in that case, after the mastectomy, the chances of developing breast cancer are significantly lower than for people without a BRCA gene mutation. Those chances aren't zero. There's around a 5% lifetime risk. So it's actually, you're much less at risk than the general population for developing breast cancer, but it's not zero. And for somebody with top surgery, please do correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that because it's not about removing the breast tissue, actually that breast tissue, some of it will be left in order to shape the chest so that there is a male structure to the chest, as opposed to the removal just of breasts, which could then later be reconstructed. And therefore, actually, you're intentionally leaving breast tissue there. And so that tissue would also be at risk of developing cancer, or breast cancer, if you are BRCA positive.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up to you, Josh? I'm just thinking back on my earlier answer, where I was asked around access to BRCA testing on the NHS. And I realised that the answer that I gave was of my knowledge of the Jewish BRCA programme, which has now come to an end. What I'm actually not 100% sure of, and I just wanted to double check with you for clinical accuracy, was when it is adopted by the NHS, what are the inclusion criteria?
Very good question. First off, I will use that as an opportunity to say, whilst the program itself has closed for new registrations, what you are able to do is currently register your interest. If you go to the jewishbrca.org website, you can register your interest, which means simply putting your email down. The program will be reopening for testing. We don't know exactly when, but it will be during 2026. So you can still register and you will be screened for that. Going on beyond, the program is going to be reopening fully, and we're incredibly pleased to hear from the NHS that it's going to become a business as usual program. This will become a permanent, ongoing program. We think it will also be expanded beyond the Jewish community, but it will take a little bit longer than normal to be screened, but that will be there. As we understand it, the current eligibility will be maintained until we are told otherwise, and that is if you are over 18, if you are living in England, and if you have at least one Jewish grandparent. We assume the only one that will change will be if you have one Jewish grandparent, but that depends on what communities are included in that screening program. Tony, I see you have a hand up.
I think you're on mute, Tony.
Ooh.
We can't hear you, Tony. I think you're on mute.
Yeah, I was on mute, but I couldn't open it up myself. Sorry about that. Okay, so I'm Tony Angel, and I chair Jnetics. I've been heavily involved with discussions with NHS England about the BRCA program, both before and after. I mean, just to give some context on that program, because it really is worth kind of just emphasizing how successful it was. 42,000 people registered in the space of 2.5 years from the Jewish community for BRCA testing, and around 30-something thousand have actually now been have returned their packs and have got or get in the course of getting their results as to whether they're BRCA positive or not. And the numbers are pretty well exactly what we would have thought. So we have several hundred, 700-800 people now who have tested positive for a BRCA mutation, BRCA1 or BRCA2 mutation, and are now, because they're aware of that, are eligible for enhanced surveillance within the NHS and more regular checking to help identify at the earliest possible stage if they are developing cancer, and then of course your prospects of dealing with that are much enhanced. So it's proved to be incredibly successful. The NHS are very happy with it, and as a result of that, they decided to make the program permanent. But it's the pilot program has come to an end. There's a certain amount of follow-up testing do it for people who have tested positive, so that their members of their family can also be tested. So there's a certain amount of follow-up still going on, but the new program will be launched, we're assured, during 2026. And it will be broader, because following the success of the program for the Jewish community, for anybody with a Jewish grandparent, there are other communities which are, for one reason or another, at a higher risk because they have a higher incidence of BRCA1 and BRCA2 mutations, who will be included in the revised program that is coming forward. And it's quite possible that over a period of a few years, it will become much more widespread than it is now, because it has proved to be pretty effective. So I just wanted to make that point.
Thank you. My fun fact, just to add on to that, is one of the key groups that are affected by BRCA mutations is from one particular island in the Shetlands called Westfrey. So it really is specific. But thank you very much, Tony. Thank you. Just actually, we've had a question in from Judith as well, around people that were, so women looking for sperm donors were advised to go to use non-Jewish sperm donors. You are correct, Judith. That is something that I believe is actually still encouraged for two reasons. One is genetic and one is more sociological. As you say, because there are less likely to be corresponding genetic variations or mutations, and so you are much less likely to develop a child with genetic disorders. Although that risk realistically is now negated with the ability to do the genetic screening. But that does require the sperm donor to have been screened before registering at the sperm bank, which I imagine is very thorough now. I don't know exactly what's tested for, but I imagine it would be very thorough. But secondly, and I am conscious of how I phrase this, because of the relative size of the Jewish community, you're much less likely to be related in some way if the sperm donor is from outside of the Jewish community, or for that child to then inadvertently meet and fall in love with somebody that they do have a relationship, kind of a biological relationship with down the line. So there are kind of two facets to that one. Okay. I've actually got a question now to ask to Ariel. So just to kind of change the context of what we've been discussing, I'm really conscious that those in the LGBT plus communities often experience health inequalities. And actually, Joe said that was one of your passions and why you're involved in Keshet UK. What are some of those key health inequalities? And in particular, what of those relate to screening or family planning?
Yeah, I think what I might do, I might let Joe take the first part of this around screening and family planning, and then I can talk about some of the wider health inequalities. Joe wants to go first.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's pretty well established that health inequalities exist for the LGBT plus community. This is for kind of a combination of different reasons, partly due to poorer access to care, barriers to inclusive testing, and crucially, particularly to me as a genomics researcher, a lack of data on individuals' sexual orientation and their gender identity within their NHS health records, which makes it really difficult to track people and therefore to monitor what's going on. But there are some things that we do know. And we do know, for example, that cancer outcomes are worse for LGBT plus individuals. And this is particularly the case for lesbian and bisexual women who tend to have lower uptake rates for cancer screening programs, in particular for cervical screening and for mammograms. And this can result in a later diagnosis and therefore, in general, poorer health outcomes in the longer term. And on top of that, we also know that LGBT plus people often face discrimination, stigma, and inadequate reproductive health services. And again, this can lead to poorer outcomes in things like family planning compared with cisgender or heterosexual individuals. So I hope that's kind of answered the first half of it. I'll pass over to you, Ariel, for the second part.
Yeah, and I think the timing of this webinar is quite fortunate, really, because there's been some recent data from the Office for National Statistics that's shown that those stark health inequalities for LGBT plus people just are not going away, unfortunately. That includes mental health challenges, limited access to preventative healthcare, and also substance misuse related deaths, and barriers to treatment for conditions such as cardiovascular issues and cancer. And as an example, alcohol related death is almost twice as high for lesbian, gay and bisexual people compared to heterosexual people. And also, according to that same data set from the Office for National Statistics, about 45% of young lesbian, gay and bisexual people who died by suicide, compared to 27% of young heterosexual people. So data is unfortunately showing us that LGBT plus people are disproportionately affected by health and well-being issues that impact their quality of life.
God, it's stark. The more you God, that's crazy. Just one thing for Joe, you said that lesbian individuals in particular present less for cervical screening. Do we know why?
I don't know the answer to this at the top of my head. My assumption would be around true and perceived barriers and stigma. So I think, and I think Ariel wants to talk a little bit about his personal experience of this actually, but how healthcare professionals might view LGBT plus individuals, and therefore people not feeling comfortable to go forward for their appointments. So perhaps we could actually come on to that question next. I think we might be jumping ahead a bit in our agenda, but that might be a relevant one to come to.
Was that about allyship?
About allyship, yeah.
Yes, of course. So we often see visible signs of allyship, like NHS Pride badges, for example. But what does meaningful inclusion and structural change actually look like beyond these symbols?
Yeah, I think for me, it's a mix of visible signs of allyship and structural change. They kind of have to work together. Both are meaningful and both are impactful, but in different ways. So if I go into a hospital, as I did a couple of years ago for some unplanned surgery, it was really meaningful to me that my doctor had a small pride pin badge. It meant that I could talk about my partner without being afraid. It meant that I immediately felt a little bit safer. So those small gestures actually can carry huge significance, especially if it could impact the care that an LGBT plus person receives. If I can speak honestly and openly with a doctor that I know I can trust, then they can make sure that I'm receiving the care that I need. But as I said, those small acts go hand in hand with looking at systems and processes and policies and staff training to make sure that assumptions aren't being made, that everyone understands those additional barriers that an LGBT plus person might have faced just going to the doctor's office. And actually the example that Joe was alluding to was just earlier this week, I picked up a prescription for my partner and I had to correct the pharmacist 3 times in a very short conversation when he kept saying she when speaking about my partner. And this pharmacy had staff wearing pride lanyards, but they hadn't really done that meaningful work in training their staff. And it's annoying, of course, having to correct people, it is, but it's also quite isolating. And if you are going into that space, it can put you off going into that space, seeking medical help, because you don't want to have to come out every single time that you go to the doctor and the pharmacist. So it is a mixture of both. Those little visible symbols matter, but it's also about making sure that staff and teams and everyone working in those environments understand that there may have been potential barriers for that LGBT person coming forward. It's about not making assumptions. And at KeshetUK, we've been doing sort of increasing amounts of work with communal organisations and businesses wanting to go beyond wearing a PIN badge, whether that is staff training or helping them with policies. And that is really meaningful to us, the fact that we're being invited into those spaces. It's showing that people understand that visible acts of allyship only really work if you do that structural policy work alongside them as well. So it's kind of a mix, it's a mix of both.
Brilliant, thank you. And actually, it's worth saying, probably from Jnetics' perspective, this is a conversation that we had many months ago, whereby we've tried really hard to have that kind of structural inclusion as in our work. So like just threaded through. For example, our website is very neutral and doesn't talk about kind of assumed gender roles and genders and orientation and things like that. Is that the kind of thing that you're talking about in that, i.e. just kind of removing that inherent assumption around people?
It is, yeah. It's about showing diversity. You know, if we're talking about different families, it's about showing diversity in those family types. So yeah, it is. It is also I think a lot of us carry assumptions around with us all the time and we don't realize we have those assumptions. So it's also about doing some of that work to try and uncover those. I'll use another sort of quick example, and this was from quite a few years ago, and I would like to think that that this has changed, and I can say it now in a sort of a joking way, but at the time it didn't seem very funny. But I was at the hospital for a checkup or something, and I mentioned, I was talking about sexual orientation. I mentioned, that I was gay, and when they asked about my job, the person, the health professional filling in their little form, so they asked, "Oh, your job, hairdresser or work in IT?" They just made this really quick. I know it is. I can laugh about it now, and it was at the time I thought, well, this is ridiculous. Now that was probably 10-ish years ago, but that wasn't said in a hurtful way. There was no malice behind that whatsoever. But there was obviously some sort of gap in staff training there, and it was just what they would perceive as probably harmless assumption, but those assumptions they can sometimes be cutting. Sometimes they can be harmful assumptions that people make. So it is about looking at everything, but I think the staff training and making sure that everyone involved understands diversity of sexual orientations, gender identities, and families. That's, to me, one of the key points.
Wow. God, that's crazy. I bet you were most offended by the fact that they thought you were an IT guy.
Well, I mean, I've always had
sorry if anybody on
hair,
here is an IT. It does work in IT.
No, I mean, I wish I was good at IT. Anyway, we're going off topic.
Okay, so following on from this, and this is more about me learning, language in this area is really important. And I remember actually from the end of my teaching days, and it became almost a joke to say, "Oh, I identify as," and that's horrific that's kind of entered life in that parlance. But language really is kind of fundamental in this area. And the whole point of allies is that we want to be there to support and to welcome people and to make spaces comfortable and inclusive. But sometimes we do make mistakes. So how can allies, professionals, community members ensure that their conversations around genetics and family are inclusive and affirming?
Yeah, I mean, I've talked about assumptions quite a lot.
Yeah.
My experience at the pharmacy was a good one there. The first thing for me is to avoid assumptions as much as you can. We aren't expecting everyone to change everything they do. We're not expecting people to get this right 100% of the time, because people make mistakes and that's fine. But we also probably need to be a bit more mindful of the diversity of families and relationships. And not assuming that everyone is heterosexual is a great basic first step. And we don't know everything. It's okay to ask people about themselves in a kind way, about offering choices rather than labels, asking people the terms that they prefer to describe themselves or their families. And again, we don't know everything. We're not going to get it right all the time, but it's about knowing how to ask kindly, knowing what to do when you make a mistake as well. Just saying, "Oh, thank you for correcting me," not making it a big deal, quickly moving on. That's all we want. And the other thing, actually, going back to what you mentioned earlier about the work that Jnetics has done, that you've done on your website, it's kind of about normalizing diversity. So looking at your website, looking at literature, social media policies, include a diverse range of examples. When diversity is presented as normal rather than exceptional, people feel immediately more welcome. And inclusive language isn't about getting it perfect, because no one can get it perfect 100% of the time. Language changes, it evolves all the time. You will get it wrong sometimes. You'll feel like it's overwhelming. It will feel confusing and frustrating, and all of that is okay. And it's also okay to not fully understand something sometimes as well. But regardless of all of that, and this is kind of key to how KeshetUK has always worked, you can still be kind. There's always room for kindness. You can learn to ask those appropriate questions. And most importantly, you can listen, and you can learn what to do when you get feedback. And it can be uncomfortable sometimes to get feedback that you don't necessarily want, but actually really listening and responding to it is one of the most powerful things that you can do. You're on mute, Josh.
Sorry, my son has just walked in asking for sweets. Say Please don't come in. Okay, so look, we've clearly got some way to go just as society. But it definitely feels like some progress is being made. Even as much as actually, I say even as much, actually, it's wonderful that there are pride badges, pride pins in the NHS. Like that's fantastic. Um, but if we were having this conversation again in 5 years' time, what would meaningful progress for LGBT plus inclusion in genetic healthcare look like? Probably Joe, if we can go to you for that. Sorry, you're on mute
Yeah,
still. There we
sorry,
go.
I was on mute. Yeah, I'm happy to take this one. So I mean, I'm giving an answer that's kind of, I guess, unique to me as a genomics researcher. But for me, what I see is one of the biggest barriers to equitable healthcare and healthcare advancement in the genomic space is that minority groups, including LGBT plus populations, have historically been quite invisible in biomedical data sets. And it's really important for us as researchers to make sure we're considering the importance of representation in the cohorts that we recruit. So both in our approach to consent and in our recruitment approach. And it's also really important that we involve these minority groups, including LGBT plus people, in study co-design, so we can make sure that we are designing our studies that are inclusive for all and that use inclusive language throughout. And I believe if we were to do this and make meaningful change here, which I know is a really tall order, but I think that over the course of the next 5 years or so, it could help in particular improve data on how gender-affirming hormone therapy interacts with hereditary cancer risk. That's a massive evidence gap that we have at the moment that we know very little about. And I think it would be hugely valuable to try and fill that evidence gap. I also think it could help improve our understanding of fertility outcomes in transgender individuals post-hormone therapy. So again, just due to kind of time constraints and kind of the number of people who have undergone hormone therapy and the number of years that have since elapsed, and as I mentioned before, how poorly the data is recorded, we have a bit of an absence of information in order to make informed clinical decisions. So I think that's an area where we could really, really further research over the course of the next 5 to 10 years. And also, I think including LGBT plus family structures in reproductive genetic research. I think, again, it's an area, we've mentioned this before already on this conversation. A lot of the kind of conversations that we have are based on heterosexual cisgender couples. And so kind of including different families, what different families look like in research, I think can really, really help improve things for reproductive genetics research over the course of the next sort of 5 to 10 years or so.
Thank you. Out of interest, and this is me completely naively, but actually thinking about how people respond with being Jewish in, say, the NHS or in research. Are people apprehensive to share their sexual orientation or gender identity with researchers or doctors, for example? Because if I just move this on to the kind of that Jewish idea, certainly with the rise of anti-Semitism that we've experienced over the last couple of years, a lot of people would say that they want to keep that identity private because, well, what's it got to do with my doctor type of thing? And just because if you see people wearing, say, a Palestinian flag badge, for example, you don't want to raise that because you just want, you want to, like, you're already in hospital, you want a quiet as possible life, right? Is there an apprehension about sharing that kind of information, or do we not tend to see that?
Ariel, should we double at this one?
Yeah.
So I'll say something very quickly, which is, I think there's two parts to this, really. I think in part, I think there may well be that, and I'll let Ariel cover that. I think one of the crucial issues here is that we actually don't know, because the way that we're asking the questions are really patchy. So, for example, if you're filling in a form in the NHS, and it will ask you what your will ask you what your ethnicity is, for example. It's very interesting because I've discussed this with my husband. I would write white British, he would write white other, because he would consider himself not like Jewish would be his.
We have a whole talk on that.
Exactly. And I think that's really, it's interesting. Different people would report in different ways. And there's often not a question on religion, and there's also not often a question on sexual orientation or gender identity, which means that we're just not capturing the information at all. So yes, there may be that some people feel apprehensive, but actually there's just an absence of the data in the first place. Even if
we're not even giving people the option,
they might, the NHS just doesn't know. Ariel, do you want to pick up?
Yeah, I mean, just to back up that final point, quite a few years ago, I was a research assistant. I'm not a scientist. I'm not going to try and pretend I am. I was a research assistant, though, in a medical school at a university, and there were always issues. But I mean, this was 12, 13-ish years ago. There were issues back then with a lot of healthcare settings not asking for sexual orientation, gender identity, and I don't think that's changed hugely. I don't know, so I don't want to say that as a certainty. That's not changed hugely, and it's the same for a lot of minority or minoritized groups as well, of just that being fearful of sharing your information. It's something that's deeply personal. You don't know how you're going to be treated by that staff member. I think especially if you've had negative experiences of healthcare in the past, which there was some research quite a few years ago, I don't know if it's been repeated, but that did show kind of systemic issues with LGBT plus phobia throughout healthcare. So if you've had issues with that in the past, and even if it was an option on the form, then I think it's probably fair to assume that you wouldn't want to give that information. But yeah, absolutely backing up most Joe's point, the biggest issue is it's just not often collected, or it'll be an option on the form, but if you've got teams who are stretched and busy and working, then they're not going to have time to go through all of that, and they'll just ask some of the basic stuff that they think is important rather than asking that full suite of questions.
Brilliant. Thank you. I think in the interest of time, we should probably kind of end our conversation there. Is there any kind of final points that you'd like to make before we kind of see if there are any questions from the audience?
I'd like to just ask Ariel one very final quick question, if that's okay. Just because I think this is a really important thing that we've possibly skipped over a little bit in this conversation. It's LGBT plus History Month. And we haven't had really an opportunity to dedicate this conversation to any of the amazing scientists who have contributed to furthering science in this field. Do you have anyone in particular? I know we don't have much time, but do you have anyone in particular, Ariel, that you want to draw attention to, and why?
Yes, I'll be quick. I will also say to check out the Jnetics and KeshetUK social media pages, as we've been highlighting pioneering scientists throughout LGBT plus History Month. So I'll be very quick, and I think one scientist who inspires me is probably Magnus Hirschfeld. He was a Jewish doctor in the early 20th century Germany, at a time when being gay was criminalized. And as a physician and as a gay man, he saw how much harm stigma caused, and he believed that science should protect people rather than marginalize them. And he spent his career showing that sexuality and gender are normal variations of human life. He founded one of the first LGBT rights organizations. He created the Institute for Sexual Science in Berlin. And it was this pioneering space that offered research, sexual health services, and some of the earliest gender affirming care. He was Jewish. He stood up for sexual minorities. So unsurprisingly, he became a target for anti-Semitic groups, and the Nazi regime destroyed the Institute, burned its archives, and essentially wiped out decades of important research. But despite that, his ideas lived on. Today, when we talk about sexuality as innate or recognize gender diversity as part of the human spectrum, we're building on the foundations that he helped create. And I think in a space like tonight, and in the work that we've been doing with Jnetics over the past year and on social media this month, his story feels particularly powerful. He showed that science and compassion absolutely belong together. And his work was attacked, but his vision endures. And so he very much continues to inspire me.
Thank you. That was an amazing way to kind of explain Magnus Hirschfeld's work. And story. Really, really inspiring individual. So thank you. Actually, I went down a bit of a rabbit hole researching him and his work. He's just simply amazing. What he had to put up with, and kind of the steadfast nature of which he believed in what he was doing, and really put himself in harm's way repeatedly, because of what he believed, and to stand up for it is simply inspiring. So thank you for raising his profile. As Ariel said, we're sharing stories of a couple of amazing people, who were scientists who were also either LGBT plus or allies, and the work that they did. Actually, a lot of what they did really touches on a lot of the issues that we've discussed tonight, especially around inclusion and isolation from health services and things. And actually, it goes to show that we have come a hell of a long way, but that there is still a long way to go. So they are some amazing scientists, like simply amazing. Okay, so on that, I think it's probably time to say thank you very, very much to Joe. Thank you very much to Ariel. There are a few questions which I'd like to quickly address. If there are any others, please do feel free to put them in the chat. Judith asked maybe some of the reasons around why cervical smears may not be taken up. I don't know if it would just be to do with STDs. But Joe also did mention that it was mammograms as well, which wouldn't be related to STDs. It could well be part of it, but I don't know. And Lizzie, yes, you are completely correct. NHS uniform dress codes do specifically prohibit the wearing of any political symbols, such as Palestinian flags or football teams, or as well. But that doesn't mean that they're always fully enforced. That's something that we have worked on with hospitals as well. Because a lot of people actually don't even realize the impact that they have on Jewish people, which is probably part of another aspect of what we've talked about tonight. People don't really realize the impact of what they say when it doesn't directly affect them. So yes, you are right. People shouldn't be wearing these symbols, but sometimes they do, and these policies aren't enforced properly. Other than that, just for a shameless plug quickly, our next scientific lecture will be in April, and we will be looking, well, it will be titled Our Genes, Our History. And it will be looking to uncover the past through the messages in our genes. Many will be familiar with genes as the instruction manual for our body and how our bodies use it to grow, follow the instruction manual to grow, repair, and function every day. But what's less well known is that within our genes is information about the past, a living history book if you know how to read it. So we will be hosting a preeminent scientist around this area, and actually how we're extracting and analyzing ancient DNA to go alongside our own, how we trace migrations, historical pandemics, and other monumental events of the past. It is a lot of what contributes into genetics and why we need to exist. But it'll be much broader as well, and talking about even back to kind of Neanderthal ages and how these migrations and movements have happened. And it's all traced in our DNA. It's really, really quite remarkable, actually. Other than that, as I say, thank you very much to Joe and Ariel. And if we don't have any other questions, thank you so much for everybody for your time this evening. If there is anything that you would like to discuss further, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Ariel and Joe. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.